We've had an explosion of gender identities, new regulations, the diversity, equity, inclusion dogma of the day. The government has become a multi-tentacled organism that has extended its reach into every aspect of society, including higher education.
Every school has had the DEI office. And then in 2024, we saw slogans like genocide for Jews, the extermination of the state of Israel, protesters citing First Amendment. We can do whatever we want. How did it become such an endemic thing in our system? We are living through some troubled times for higher education. In 2024, we saw massive protests across university campuses. We've also seen top-down challenges to the world of higher ed. Most recently, in August 2024, changes from the Biden administration to Title IX went into effect. And here to talk to us about those currents today is Ken Tashjy. We are excited to have him. He served as the general counsel for Massachusetts Community College System for over 21 years, and he currently serves as a consultant higher education attorney and advisor in that space. He has taught as an adjunct instructor at Suffolk University since 2008 and previously at Brandeis University as a Guberman Teaching Fellow. He writes frequently at Campus Reform, which is a product of the Leadership Institute. So Ken, welcome to Edify.
Well, Erika, thanks very much for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I'm really excited to dig into everything higher ed today. It's a fascinating journey, to say the least. So first, I want to focus on Title IX and the changes to that. First of all, could you run us through a little bit about the original purpose of Title IX and what happened with the Biden administration regulation changes?
Sure. So back in 1972, Congress passed a bill and President Nixon signed into law Title IX of the educational rights and acts back in that period. And the real purpose and focus of Title IX was to end discrimination and inequities based on sex in education that had created significant barriers to women in achieving and accessing higher education and other functional aspects of elementary and secondary education. And the law was primarily and chiefly focusing on bringing down those barriers that had stood in the way of girls and women in education. And Title IX has been in effect for over 52 years. It has opened many doors and created many opportunities for girls and women in education and continues to do so today. And the real challenge currently that we're facing is under the Biden administration's Department of Education's revised Title IX regulations, they've sought to extend protections that, again, were historically geared towards girls and women to biological males who identify as females and extending those protections broadly to gender identity. And that's a real issue today. And it's a challenge that's confronting higher education, elementary and secondary education, and in the manner in which they serve girls and biological women. And it's raised significant concerns across higher education. And that is why there's been so many legal challenges thus far pushing back on the implementation of these regulations.
Right. I think at the time they went into effect, there were 26 states that had raised legal challenges, and judges had actually blocked these rules from going into effect. I want to back up just a little bit. So Title IX, most people think of it as the women's sports bill or act. And so they think of it as this was the way that women could have the same sports and competitive opportunities at colleges and universities that male athletes had enjoyed previously. But it hasn't always been smooth sailing in that straightforwardness. I think the Biden administration's most recent attempts to kind of hijack Title IX for this broader trans agenda was preceded by, during the Obama administration, using Title IX as a way to combat, at the time, the sexual harassment concerns, rape concerns going on campuses. And the way that it was implemented, I think it served to create almost a parallel legal system at these colleges and universities under the Obama administration. I don't know if you can speak to that use of Title IX at all, and how this bill that's about women seems to be used throughout history in ways not intended by its framers.
Well, look, back in the Obama administration era, they issued what was known as a Dear Colleague letter that advised institutions on how they should implement Title IX. And unfortunately, that Dear Colleague letter never went through the regulatory process that's usually followed when you're implementing regulations. There's a notification period, there's a comment period, usually lasting upwards of over a year, where individuals within the society and within communities that are knowledgeable in these areas comment and make recommendations, and then ultimately the regulations are finalized and then issued. That wasn't the process that was followed under the Obama administration with regard to Title IX, when they just simply issued a Dear Colleague letter with the threat that if you failed to comply, you were jeopardizing your federal funding. And that's really always the hammer used in and around implementing regulations regarding Title IX, that if you fail to comply with those regulations, you may suffer loss of federal funding. And for most institutions, public and private, that's the lifeblood of their financial underpinnings. And without federal financial aid or federal financial support or funding, those institutions would cease to exist. So we had that under the Obama administration. Then when President Trump came in office, his Department of Education went through the appropriate comment period, advising period, drafting period, then came up with final regulations and implemented those regulations around Title IX. And now with the Biden administration coming in, after 3.5 years, they've issued new Title IX regulations that in many ways gut the regulations that were in place for the 4 years of the Trump administration. And this is often a challenge, frankly, whether you're a Republican administration or a Democratic administration. These regulatory agencies come in with new administrations and seek to overturn prior regulations. And the real challenge there is, and particularly in higher education, is that every 4 years, you've got to adjust now to new regulations, and there's absolutely no certainty with regards to how Title IX is going to be interpreted or applied literally every 4 years. And it makes it very, very difficult to craft policies and procedures and to be consistent in those policies and procedures. And that's part of the reason why you've had such significant pushback here against the Department of Education, because there's a real belief that they've grossly exceeded their authority in the way they've revised these regulations, and that the courts need to step in now and rectify that situation moving forward. And that's significant, and that's an important point here, and one that I hope the courts will take very seriously in addressing the concerns that have been raised about these regulations.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of judges have already said, let's put the brakes on this, because it needs more consideration before you blow up the Title IX. So let's return to the Biden administration regulations for a minute. Some on the left, I'm going to play you a clip in a few minutes with a political pundit, one of my favorites. But they've characterized this as the changes to Title IX here are intended to expand the definitions. Originally, sex was understood to refer to male or female. And now as our society has progressed in their terminology, we need to expand those definitions to include gender identity. How do you respond to that kind of characterization when they're emphasizing, there's so much violence against so-called trans men and women that we need to now protect them as well and make the campuses safe for them as well, and sports and locker rooms safe for them as well? How do you respond to those sort of appeals to compassion coming from the left with regards to these regulations?
Well, the appeals to compassion are morally based, and look, and nobody should be subject to discrimination in education, period. I think we can all agree on that. But it's the process of which you follow to achieve those ends, and the process of allowing the Department of Education, which is an unelected, unaccountable federal agency, to exceed its authority by really turning on its head the original intent and purpose of Title IX, which was to end discrimination and inequities based on sex against women in education, is not the appropriate mechanism. The Department of Education, like all other federal agencies, have regulatory authority to issue rules and issue regulations that seek to achieve the original intent of the law as written by Congress. And so I would assert that if you look back at the congressional and legislative history and record of Title IX as far back as 1972, there's going to be no evidence to support the assertion that at the time the law was enacted, that it contemplated extending protections beyond biological males and biological females, much less to gender identity. And we have to recognize, and we've been told this time and time again, that gender identity is not a constant, that it's a fluid concept, that it can change day to day, hour to hour, minute to minute. And if you live in New York City, the Human Rights Commission there will tell you that there are at least 31 gender identities. And again, I would challenge anyone to point back to the legislative or congressional history or record from 1972 that would indicate that Congress or President Nixon contemplated this law's application beyond biological males and females, much less to potential gender identities that at the time was not part of their consideration. And look, if Congress wants to change Title IX to expand its protections to those based on gender identity, it has every authority and right to do so. Congress can pass a bill through the House and Senate tomorrow. It would land on President Biden's desk, and I assume soon thereafter he would sign it. And that's the appropriate mechanism to adjust and to modify the aspects of Title IX, but not through a process where an unaccountable and elected federal agency that is often motivated ideologically or politically to make those changes. And that's just not the process that was established under the Constitution. And putting all the moralistic and the humanistic and emotional aspects aside, that really needs to be the process we stick to. Otherwise, there's no rules. And we just can't have that.
Yeah, I want to get back to the question of regulatory agencies and sort of the federal bureaucracy and its role in our lives. So I'm going to just put a little bookmark there. I'm looking at this Title IX, just for people who are listening and maybe not as familiar with what this will mean practically. So if the Biden regulations and changes are not challenged, are not removed, what does this mean for, say, a young 19-year-old girl? She gets invited to compete for a swim scholarship at State University, and how does this change her prospects? What her college experience could be?
Sure, this is profound. The impact this is going to have on biological girls and biological women in elementary, secondary, and higher education. So really what the effect is, and let me just qualify that, we've got 26 states right now where preliminary injunctions have been issued. And what that means is in those states, those judges who had the challenge come before him or her concluded that the plaintiffs in those cases, the people seeking to block these regulations from being implemented in their states, those plaintiffs raised significant arguments that the court concluded that there was a high likelihood that when these matters go to trial, those plaintiffs will prevail. And that if these regulations were not halted before their implementation, those plaintiffs would suffer irreparable harm. And so as a result of that, 26 states have blocked the implementation of the regs, leaving 24 states to implement the regulations, which went into effect on August 1st. And what those regulations will mean practically is that now moving forward, biological males who identify as females will have full and open access to all educational programs and activities that receive federal funding. And what this practically means is that in elementary school, middle school, high school, colleges, and universities, boys or men that identify as females will now have open access to participation on athletic teams. They'll have unlimited access to privately or traditionally identified as private female spaces like bathrooms and locker rooms and showers, single-sex residence halls. They'll also have access and be eligible for athletic and academic scholarships and other opportunities that were traditionally reserved for females. And on this last point, let me emphasize that there is not an unlimited amount of scholarships and academic opportunities and athletic opportunities to go around. It is really a zero-sum game. And for every boy or male who identifies as a female that achieves one of those and receives one of those scholarships for athletics or academics, that's one less available for a biological girl or woman. And I think that's an extremely regressive approach. It indeed puts us back to the pre-Title IX era where the discrimination and inequities based on sex prevailed. And that is the realities of the implementation of these regulations in 24 states. And again, I go back to the point that I'm raising less of an issue with gender identity and much more of an issue with an unaccountable, unelected federal agency grossly exceeding its authority when it's modified and changed these regulations in such a manner without the constitutional basis to do so.
Yeah. I mean, it's chilling. I have 5 daughters, and thinking about them having to face these kinds of conditions and because of this regulation change, which seems so ideologically driven. It's so easy to forget when you're thinking about regulations and, political and all this lofty stuff. It's easy to forget that this is going to affect actual girls walking onto campuses this fall. So we absolutely need to shed light on that. I want to go ahead and play you the clip of, again, someone on the left, and she's Brianna Joy Gray. She has a few comments on this that I would just like to get your reaction to. I think
Sure.
Her characterization of what's going on is what a lot of people might hear when they're watching mainstream media or et cetera. So I'd love to get your thoughts on this.
People can disagree about it. I personally think it's a good thing to protect all students, including young men, from being railroaded in these in a kind of due process-less trial. But I'm not going to sit here and not say that the underlying value of recognizing that of all of the ways people get discriminated against. In the 70s, they weren't thinking about gay people like that. They were thinking just about women. Now we have a better understanding of all of the ways that discrimination happens. Well, why wouldn't you want to protect LGBT kids?
So, look, I can appreciate what this individual has said about her views, but they are indeed just her views. As she indicated, these are her personal views and positions. And I think everyone would agree that it's important that federal regulations, federal law, not be dictated on someone's personal or individual views. And again, as I said earlier, no one should be discriminated against in education. But the reality here is that these regulations prioritize and elevate the rights of biological boys and men who identify as women over and above the interest and rights of biological girls and females. And it's contradictory of the purpose and intent originally behind Title IX. And again, if Congress wants to modify Title IX to extend protections based on gender identity, it can do so, but we can't do that and must not do that based on an emotional argument that, frankly, doesn't recognize the corresponding significant impact these regulations are going to have on the privacy rights of girls and women in education. That seems to be a blind spot for a lot of the advocates here, that they just simply do not recognize the impact this is going to have on girls and women. And I do find it somewhat ironic that we're hearing, whether it be politicians or other advocates in and around this issue, telling girls and women just frankly to get over it. Showering in a locker room with a biological male who's fully intact, just get over it. Sharing a bathroom with a biological male fully intact, just get over it. When in a lot of ways, that's the very same refrain that we heard pre-Title IX back in the 60s and 70s when women would complain about sexual harassment in education. Just get over it. And again, I can appreciate this individual's personal views and perspectives, but our federal laws can't be drafted, applied, or dictated based on that.
Yeah, it seems like a disdain for, at worst, a disdain and hatred of the rule of law and our systems. Maybe at best, most charitable interpretation, ignorance of how the American legal system works to protect the rights of individuals. And my reaction is, well, if we have these laws in place to protect women, if there's another constituency, another population that needs protection, why aren't we working to pass a law to protect them instead of blowing up the rights and protections for females? It doesn't make sense to me. There was another Supreme Court case this year that I wanted to get your thoughts on. So in June, the Supreme Court overturned what's known as the Chevron Doctrine. And we've talked a lot about that here at Catholic Vote, and on Loopcast, we've talked about how this decision by the Supreme Court could be a way of undoing the sort of rule of the federal bureaucracy of these unelected bureaucratic officials who do things like bastardize Title IX. And I wanted to get your thoughts on, does the overturning, first of all, if you could speak to what is the Chevron Doctrine, and does the overturning of that doctrine give us any hope in this area?
This decision, while it hasn't attracted as much attention in the press as other decisions by the Supreme Court, I frankly think this is probably one of the most profound decisions the court has entered in a very long time. What this decision says is that what we had in existence for about 40 years was known as the Chevron decision. And simply put, under the Chevron decision, if there was an ambiguity in a federal law, or there was some unclear aspect of a federal law, and let's all acknowledge, right, the Congress writes these laws. In many cases, they write them but with efforts to compromise on both sides. They leave language unclear or ambiguous in order to get the legislation passed. And then once it's passed and signed into law, it then is referred to the regulatory agency that's going to enforce the law, in this case, Department of Education enforcing Title IX. And the agency is responsible for drafting regulations that will achieve the objectives of the statute, and not circumvent it, not overturn it, but just to achieve the objectives, as we talked a little bit earlier. And what Chevron said was that if there is an ambiguity in the federal law, something is unclear, then an agency has the authority to clear up that ambiguity in the regulations, and that courts would be obligated to defer to the agency's interpretation. And what the court said about 40 years ago, the Supreme Court said about 40 years ago, is that they would base that deference on some level of special competence that was assigned to these federal agencies in interpreting federal law. And for the better part of 40 years, we've had an explosion in the regulatory bureaucracy in the United States because courts have time and time again deferred to federal agencies' interpretation of ambiguities in federal law. And in the context of Title IX, if the Chevron Doctrine was still in effect, the Department of Education could simply argue that there was an ambiguity under Title IX, and it was unclear whether Title IX actually did apply to gender identity beyond biological males and biological females. And we are simply clearing up that ambiguity, and our interpretation is reasonable. And federal courts, including the Supreme Court, would have to defer to that interpretation. Well, as you indicated, about a month and a half ago, the Supreme Court struck down the Chevron Doctrine. And the court ruled in that case that there is no special competence that federal agencies have over interpreting federal law. And in fact, under their Article 3 of the U.S. Constitution and under federal law, the decision to interpret, or the authority to interpret federal law, rests in the hands of the federal courts, not in the federal bureaucracy. And while federal courts can consider an agency's advice or guidance as advisory, they were no longer obligated to defer to the federal agency's interpretation. So back in May, before the Chevron Doctrine was overturned, the Department of Ed would make an argument that, look, you've got to defer to us, federal court, because we made a reasonable interpretation about an ambiguity in the law. Now, post the doctrine being repealed by the court, that no longer will stand, and the federal courts, including the U.S. Supreme Court, will have the independence to make a judgment on, in fact, what was the original intent of Title IX, and has the interpretation by the Department of Education exceeded what those original what the original intent of the statute indeed was.
Yeah, and you talk a lot about original intent of a law, and it seems that, at this point on the Supreme Court, we have that split between the justices, between originalists who look to the original intent on the Supreme Court with the Constitution, the Founding Fathers' intentions, and then we have I don't even know what we would call what they call the liberal justices, but it's not liberalism so much as the Constitution's meaning changes as society changes. And it seems like the people arguing for these changes to Title IX are more of that bent, right? Where the laws need to morph. The original intent of the law was part of this sort of, I don't know, caveman past that we had where we thought there were only two sexes. So we're totally justified in saying, oh, Title IX covers all 31 genders. This more, morphic relativistic way of interpreting law versus what you're saying is that the American project is entirely built on original intent of the Constitution of laws. Is that a fair kind of explanation of the differences here?
Sure. And what I would just point out, though, is when I'm referring to originalist intent of Title IX, we're not referring back to the founders 250 years ago. What we're referring to is the Congress's intent back in 1972. And, all you really do need to do is look back to the pre-Title IX era in the 1960s and the early 70s when girls and women faced significant barriers in education. They had little, if any, access to athletics. They had little, if any, access to admission to undergraduate or graduate institutions. They had little, if any, availability to access, if they were enrolled, STEM programs, science, technology, engineering, and math, or career or technical training, or eligibility for academic or athletic scholarships. I'll also point out that in the 1960s, early 70s, less than 60% of girls had high school diplomas, and only about 8% of women had college degrees. And it was to address those very inequities based on sex that Title IX was enacted. And that was specifically the intent of that law. And again, if Congress wants to change the original intent of the law, it can do so, but not through the legislative arm, or the regulatory arm of the Department of Education. Yeah.
So I'd like to shift our conversation now to another sort of trend in higher education. That sounds so innocuous when we're talking about protesters camping out on campus greens. But the other big story in 2024 at the university level were, of course, the pro-Gaza and pro-Hamas protests that we were seeing following October 7th and more intensely as the spring semester of 2024 progressed. And many of, we saw most radically places like Columbia, Humboldt, and less so at other campuses. But many of the protesters were citing First Amendment, right? We have free speech. We can do whatever we want. And we're protected here on these campuses. And so we saw slogans like, genocide for Jews. We saw from the river to the sea, which is interpreted as the extermination of the state of Israel. This kind of very violent rhetoric going on under what they claimed was the protection of First Amendment. And I know you've written extensively on this and advised extensively on this. Could you sort of give our listeners a sense of what happened during these protests, and were these claims of First Amendment protections valid?
Sure. So as you indicated, we saw across the country a huge number of protests, anti-Israeli protests, pro-Palestinian, pro-Hamas protests throughout higher education. And we also saw, as a result of that, a variety of responses by those institutions. Some institutions dealt with those incidents very quickly and dispersed protesters immediately. Other campuses took some time. Others just sat back and let things unfold without doing much of anything. And what we saw was a significant amount of harassment and discrimination, intimidation, and threats occurring on college campuses around the country with little or any response from administrators. And as you point out, a lot of the protesters and a lot of those individuals who supported the protesters spoke about First Amendment free speech rights, and the right to peacefully protest is ingrained and central to the First Amendment free speech and expression rights that we all enjoy under the First Amendment. And that is indeed true. But a lot of what we saw on college campuses had little to do with peaceful protests, and really was conduct that was outside the scope and protection of the First Amendment. And before I get into that, let me just also point out that I think one piece of information that was lacking from a lot of this reporting is that the First Amendment has absolutely no application whatsoever on private college campuses. The First Amendment only applies to the government, both federal and state, or to public entities like public universities and public colleges. So places like Columbia University or Yale University or Harvard University, they are not forced or compelled to comply with the First Amendment, meaning they have no obligation whatsoever to provide First Amendment protections to students or protesters on their campuses. So in fact, those private institutions have much greater latitude to deal with the protests than, say, a public institution who must comply with the First Amendment. Now, that doesn't mean a Harvard or a Yale or Columbia do not respect free speech rights as opposed to First Amendment free speech protections. Of course, on those campuses, private college campuses, private university campuses, they talk about ensuring the ability to express yourself, ensuring the ability to engage in open speech, debate, and dialogue. But that's different than having a First Amendment protected right. So again, I would just point out that on these private college university campuses, when you have presidents talking about needing to respect the First Amendment rights of students, that's misleading. There are no First Amendment protected rights on private college campuses, and private colleges have a much greater level of authority to combat speech and conduct on their campuses, as we saw was occurring during these protests. So with regards to the protests themselves, again, I point out that the First Amendment indeed protects peaceful protests. Indeed protects the right of students and others to gather on a public college campus to express their views and positions strongly and loudly. But it also allows for the government or for a public college campus to set restrictions on peaceful protests, when those protests can occur, how they can occur, where they can occur. Just for example, if it's during final exams, you're never going to allow a protest, peaceful or otherwise, to occur outside of an exam building, because that's going to undermine the real purpose and intent of the institution, which is teaching and learning. It's not to allow people to protest. It's allow for people to come to class, to learn, to be educated, to take their exams, and to be successful. What we saw in a lot of the college campuses was anything but peaceful protests. We saw illegal encampments on many campuses. We saw conduct that, as I said, would amount to discrimination or intimidation or threats, harassment, assault. We saw circumstances, for example, at UCLA where a Jewish student was barred by other students from entering campus, prohibiting that individual from taking advantage of the educational opportunities that he actually paid for. And we saw these kinds of circumstances around the country. We saw significant damage to college property at Columbia and other institutions, all under the guise of a peaceful protest. And again, it was anything from or anything close to a peaceful protest. Institutions had every right to address this conduct directly through either disciplinary procedures at their institution or through calling in law enforcement. And what's unfortunate is what we've seen now is, although many were allegedly arrested as a result of their conduct, we've seen across the country where district attorneys have dropped the charges or failed to pursue charges or have implemented some alternative type of law enforcement mechanism for addressing this conduct. And all that, frankly, is done is incentivized further protests, which I expect will erupt this fall.
Yeah, I was going to ask you what you think the 24-25 school year. Before we get to that, though, so you've spoken very clearly about the authority that these administrators do have. And I remember very vividly that congressional hearing where we saw Claudine Gay of Harvard University, Liz McGill of Penn, sitting there and saying, "Oh no, we can't do anything about this," knowing that in fact they have the authority. And I assume they knew they could have at any point done something to stop, this violent speech, in some case actual physical violence, from occurring. What do you think is the reason why they chose not to and then pled that they couldn't? Like, why knowing that we have the power to do this, why didn't higher education, the administration, show more chutzpah, for lack of a better word?
Sure. Look, I also want to point out one thing, that I'm a staunch supporter of free speech rights. And I'm one of those folks who firmly believe in more speech is better speech. I've always taken the philosophy, and I've advised my clients accordingly. And I served as general counsel for over 21 years for 15 institutions of higher education. I always advised them when it came to speech issues, don't save people from themselves. Oftentimes institutions will try to prohibit speech that they think is hurtful or distasteful or offensive. Frankly, that type of speech is protected speech under the First Amendment. I have a right to offend you under the First Amendment. I have the right to engage in chants like "The River to the Sea," which is offensive, I'm sure, to many students, including Jewish students, but I believe that's protected speech. And again, my suggestion is, don't try to limit the speech because you find it distasteful or offensive or hurtful to people. Let them chant as they are chanting. Let people see where they align themselves politically and ideologically. I think that's very important on these college campuses. But again, I reiterate that the speech protections in higher education are very broad and very deep, and there are only very few categories where you can prohibit speech on campus. And that really lies under speech which is discriminatory or is and amounts to threats or intimidation or incites imminent violence, like right now, not violence in the future, but it has to be imminent right now. And the person speaking has to have a means for actually initiating that violence. So again, there's very few categories of speech that you can prohibit on college campuses. So when those presidents spoke about an inability to react, I think while indeed they probably would not have wanted to prohibit speech which was protected speech, they could have regulated that speech in a number of ways, again, through when the speech occurred, how it occurred, and where it occurred, through time, place, and manner restrictions. But in many cases, they failed to do that. I also think by not taking appropriate and swift action, they allowed these groups to gain a foothold on their campuses, which made it much more difficult to remove them from their campuses and gave those groups much better access to depriving other students their rights of engaging in the educational services and benefits they paid for on their campuses.
One of the pieces that's missing from a lot of the reporting is the high percentage of protesters who were not even students at the campus. So we had at Columbia, I believe, in the arrests, there were over 60% of those arrested were not even affiliated with the university, but were a group coming in.
Sure.
But to get back to the question of why...
Erika, let me just make a point.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, sure. If I could just make a point of the issue, because I think it's an important point. Remember, we had presidents, many of these presidents, who were negotiating with these protesters. And it was under the guise of, well, these are our students, and we're negotiating with them to try to come to a reasonable and a peaceful resolution of their issues. Well, if in fact most of these protesters were not your students, but they were outside agitators, who were you negotiating with? And why would you have engaged in negotiations with individuals who had absolutely no right or investment on your campus other than to undermine the safety and security of your campus and of the students, the faculty, and staff on it? So, to me, that's a little bit of a red herring when you have college administrators on one hand saying we need to negotiate with the protesters and agitators because they're our students, and on the other hand, turn around and say, well, it really wasn't our students; it was a lot of outside agitators. And look, and to your point, why do presidents and have presidents acted like this? I guess I think there are a couple of reasons, right? I think number one, we used to have a theory in philosophy in higher education called a loco parentis, that administrators were acting in the place of parents. And I think in some cases, college presidents forgot their role as the chief operating officer of their institution and the person chiefly responsible for maintaining safety and security, and instead took a much more of a coddling role with these protesters, maybe as a parent might. I also think that some presidents actually agreed with the views of protesters and found it very difficult to separate their personal views with their professional obligations. And thirdly, I think there were many presidents who are devotees and supporters of the diversity, equity, inclusion dogma of the day, and believe that if they were to have ended these protests in a strong manner, that they would have been labeled an oppressor under the DEI dogma of the day. And I just think they couldn't have that. And whatever the reason, these presidents abrogated their responsibility of maintaining safe and secure campuses and ensuring that the teaching and learning process could continue. And as I've indicated in a number of different articles at Campus Reform and most recently in the Washington Times, that these presidents are going to need to step up in the fall because these groups are reloading and they're coming back ready, willing, and able to want to disrupt the educational environment again. And we just can't have a repeat of that this fall.
Yeah. So looking ahead to the year to come, I think a lot of people hoped that over the summer, these issues on the college campuses would evaporate. People would leave. They would kind of forget about it. It doesn't seem like you think that's a reasonable hope at this point. It seems that to a lot of these, we think of campus protests as sort of a feature, not a bug of the American university system. We have protests from the 60s. We had them in the 80s. And there's always the sort of the issue of the day, whether it's the Iranian, hostage crisis back in the day, or if it was the Vietnam War. And this past year, it was Israel-Gaza. Do you see Israel-Gaza continuing to be the flashpoint and anti-Semitism continuing to be an issue, or do you see the revolution moving on to the next topic?
Look, I think you're right. I mean, a lot of ways people have questioned the credibility and the validity of the protesters' commitment to this issue when we've seen over the last 3, 4, 5 years, just in essence, a changing of signs at the protest. But look, let's take them at their word. They are protesting what they believe to be the inappropriate acts of Israel in the Middle East. I don't think their position on those issues have changed. I think come fall, particularly with potential escalations in the Middle East and maybe a second front in the war involving Hezbollah in the north, is going to reinvigorate these organizations. And they're going to show up again, I think, in large numbers on college campuses, whether, again, it's students or whether it's outside agitators who use these campuses as a flashpoint for greater protests around the country. I also think as we get to November, the presidential election, that is going to indeed as well be a flashpoint. So, I think this is the problem with the manner in which so many of these presidents handled these protests, that they simply, what they gained was a temporary cessation and hostilities by compromising and capitulating to the protesters. And that's done nothing more than incentivize their return in the fall. And I'd like to point out there's been, however, a number of presidents around the country that I think did an excellent job. One case was at the University of Florida, and President Ben Sasse, who I understand has just announced his retirement from Florida, University of Florida. But President Sasse was very decisive in the way in which he handled the protests. And he was very clear right out of the gate that he indeed and the university would respect the First Amendment, free speech and expression rights of students to protest on campus. But that respect came with limits. And if you exceeded those limits, you were going to be subject to discipline. And he used the law enforcement on campus to help assert and assist with breaking up those protests. But it was not done, under the cover and darkness of night. I mean, there was sufficient warnings given. Students were advised of what their rights were. Students were advised of what the consequences and implications were going to be. And after they failed to disperse, they were arrested and subsequently were disciplined. So there is an effective way to handle this if the president has indeed the backbone to do it. And I would hope many presidents come fall are preparing now for what they're going to need to do in the fall to address this.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought up Ben Sasse. And we're praying for his wife who's very sick. But I'm glad you brought up him and the University of Florida, the Florida system, because I did want to touch on, you mentioned earlier DEI and how so many of these college presidents who lack the political will to act effectively with regards to these protests and thereby put the education of their students at peril. So many of them are caught up in this diversity, equity, and inclusion ideology, and not just an ideology, this institution that sort of made itself a home in our educational institutions. And of course, the Florida system has been dismantling DEI. There was another blow to the sort of race-based thinking from the Supreme Court in 2023 when they ended race-based discriminatory admissions policies for schools around the country. I wanted to ask you first about DEI and what role you think it has played. First of all, how did it become such a big thing? I mean, every school I've looked at with my daughters has had the DEI office. And how did it become such an endemic thing in our system? And what has the effect been, besides presidents like Claudine Gay, what has the effect been on our education system?
You look, I think in many cases, higher education, like corporate America, implemented diversity, equity, inclusion programs and staffing following the George Floyd protests as an effort to try to avoid the kind of disruption and protest that could occur on their campuses or in the corporate boardrooms. I do think that was a reaction to those circumstances. And we saw that exponentially increase across higher education with the development and implementation of diversity, equity, inclusion programming, diversity, equity, inclusion staffing. So much so that we had for a number of years many institutions requiring individuals applying for faculty positions to articulate in their application materials how they were committed to and it's been supportive of diversity, equity, inclusion programming. And if you failed to present sufficient evidence of your DEI bona fides, you were likely overlooked or bypassed for those positions. And that's unfortunate because the more and more we move in that direction, there's a legitimate argument to be made that we've lost sight of merit-based hiring and admission practices. And that was part of what we saw with the U.S. Supreme Court's decision to strike down the use of race as a factor in admissions in higher education. That even though earlier in the litigation history of affirmative action in higher ed, it had only been considered a factor in admissions, that over time it had become, in essence, the factor in admissions. And it had become a primary source of making admission decisions. And that was, again, outside the scope of what the court had authorized years ago. And the court saw fit to eliminate its use and to focus on race, non-race factors in the admissions process. And I think you're starting to see corporate America and higher education start to reshift and refocus away from diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, and more so based on a merit-based process. And that's really important today. And I think it goes without saying why that's important, right? We're looking, if we go back to the original intent of higher education, any education, is to prepare students academically to be able to excel and to be a contributor to our civic engagement and our society. And the further we get away from that, the more and more we've gotten away from the original purpose and intent of education and turning into something that is just very different and distinct than what those original goals were. And I think it's important for higher ed to try to refocus these days, and we're starting to see that across the board.
Yeah, we're hoping for some good news this November as well in that direction.
Erika, let me also just add on this. I mean, we saw the impact of the kind of diversity, equity, inclusion thinking on faith-based organizations in higher education around the country, where many faith-based organizations were denied memberships or authorization as a student organization on their campuses because of their membership or leadership requirements. And in essence, many of these faith-based groups would require their members or the leaders to support and espouse the beliefs of the group, right? So you would make sense. But many of these faith-based groups were denied student body recognition or student group recognition because of those very membership requirements. While at the same time, colleges and universities would allow other organizations to use certain criteria for their members or leaders that they found permissible. So, for example, at the University of Iowa, a faith-based student group there that espoused a requirement that its leaders needed to believe in traditional marriage was denied student group recognition. While you had an organization there, an LGBT group organization there, that in essence prohibited its members or leaders from espousing that traditional marriage belief, and they were allowed and authorized to be a student organization on campus. So you really can't have it both ways.
Right.
So this diversity, equity, inclusion mantra was also used as a hammer against those groups that espoused views and beliefs that contradicted the DEI dogma of the day. And again, that's contradictory to the mission and message of higher education, which is to be an open and accessible environment for all thoughts, ideas, and debate and dialogue.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like we've been talking about two efforts from the federal government to preserve that open environment. And so we have Title IX trying to make it more open and accessible for women to join. We have the affirmative action efforts prior to the court's decision trying to, bring in people of more racial diversity. It seems like these efforts to place the finger on the scale from the federal government can so easily over time become actually a vehicle for increased discrimination. What do you see as the proper role of the federal government in overseeing the life of the university versus too much interference? I don't know if that's too broad of a question, but what's the danger? Where do you resist it? Yeah.
Sure. Look, I think like many who have more of a conservative mindset, we firmly believe that the regulatory state has become, a multi-tentacled organism here. That it is an octopus that has extended its reach into every aspect of society, including higher education, and that in many cases you've undermined the ability of institutions to operate and to conduct business based on its mission and purpose, which is to engage in teaching and learning. And look, I can point to a specific example in these current Title IX regulations where I think, again, the Department of Education's efforts to circumvent the original intent of the law is going to have a specific and detrimental impact on the First Amendment free speech rights of, say, for example, faculty on campus. We know that the First Amendment both prohibits the government from restricting your ability to speak and also compelling you to speak, right? So the government can't say you must say this because it's a governmental message and we like it and we want you to say it, nor can the government prohibit you from speaking because the government finds your speech, frankly, distasteful. That the First Amendment protects us as individuals from that level of governmental intrusion. But if you look at these federal regulations regarding Title IX, what they indeed do will compel certain speech that the government finds appropriate and will seek to prohibit speech that it finds distasteful. And I'll give you an example. Faculty may now be forced in the classroom to use preferred gender pronouns. And if they fail to, they may be subject to a violation of these federal regulations under Title IX. They may be now forced to use gender-neutral terms in the classroom because a gender-specific term like pregnant woman will be offensive to those who identify as being pregnant but not as a woman. And they would have to now start using the term birth giver. Or if you're a faculty member and you point out that there are indeed scientifically only two sexes, or if you challenge the gender identity ideology today that men, quote unquote, men can have periods or give birth or breastfeed. All of this, this type of expression in the classroom could be regulated or compelled by the federal government through these regulations. And compelling speech in this manner or prohibiting speech in this manner is a direct violation of First Amendment protections, also not to mention the academic freedom of instructors in the classroom. So we've got to be very careful about the extent to which we continue to allow federal agencies through the regulatory process to have a detrimental impact, in this case, in the classroom, both in elementary, secondary, and higher education.
Yep. And you are on the front lines of that. So thank you so much. Ken, where can people go to find more of your materials and find out more?
Yeah, I would just suggest that, I think it's very important for people that are interested in these issues to help educate themselves. And it's important that they look to the resources that are out there, like Campus Reform, that does a tremendous job on reporting on these types of issues in higher education, and to stay abreast of developments. Also understand and recognize that your state's laws may be very different from the federal law. I live in Massachusetts. We have state laws here that mirror, in essence, the protections that these Title IX regulations are seeking to implement. So you need to understand and appreciate what the distinct laws are in your state. And if you want to be active in addressing these matters in your state, there are both local and national organizations that you can reach out to. And I would encourage all individuals to use those agencies and those organizations as a resource to push back in their communities when they believe that the regulatory authority of agencies have exceeded what their intent is and the original authority is that they've had, and they start interfering with just the day-to-day lives of individuals.
We will definitely point people in your direction. Ken Tashjy, thank you for joining us on Edify.
Yeah, Erika, thanks very much for having me. I appreciate your time.